think we're all looking forward to hearing from Don Christopher, so I would like to welcome him and introduce him again. He's had some really quite long experience with synodality, and particularly the synod that preceded the two more recent synods that Pope Francis has organised. And I think he found that there was a great deal of difference between the synod that he was involved in and the next ones that came along. And I'm sure he has a great deal of wisdom to share with all of us. So thank you again very much.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, with your community, to share your celebration of the Eucharist and to spend a little time with you now. Thanks for the invitation of my dear cousin Michael Duro. Just a word about my personal history. I was born in Brighton, Melbourne, where my family had lived for many years, and then in 1952, when I was a babe in arms and the youngest of four boys, the family emigrated to England for reasons of business, a role that my father was given in Europe. And we set out on the SS Orchids from Port Melbourne, and we went to bed, and my mother tells me that she woke up and to her horror looked out the porthole window and realised she was looking at the Mornington Peninsula. And how come we hadn't got further? Well, the answer was the ship was stuck on a sandbar. And it became a famous incident that this ship had got stuck on a sandbar in Port Phillip Bay. Anyway, we eventually made it to England. We came back to Australia every 4 years, which was some of my most exciting memories. And I was brought up to be Australian, even though I don't sound like it. So it's a pleasure to be back here to see Michael and my other cousins. I've been asked to speak to you about synodality, and I thought I'd begin in two places. One is my experience as what is laughingly called an expert at the Synod on Young People, Faith and Vocation that was held back in, I think it was 2018. And the way the Synod worked in those days was that there were the Synod fathers, with the emphasis on fathers, who were mainly bishops with a few heads of religious orders and a few specially nominated members. Then there were observers who were mainly lay people and religious sisters, and then there were experts who were a mix of clergy, lay people and religious. And I was one of the experts. And the way that it worked was that the bishops would speak interminably, and we, the experts, had copies of their talks, and we would simply mark any sections that we thought were significant. And at the end of the day, we would compile what we thought was significant in what was being said, and gradually out of that emerged the final document that we wrote. At the end of each day, the Pope, who actually, he didn't preside, he did preside, but he didn't chair it. He presided without chairing. And at the end of each day, there was a time for discussion. The bishops didn't understand what discussion meant or not. What happened was, a bishop would stand up and reinforce a point he'd made earlier, or he'd disagree with a point that somebody else had made. What was fascinating was Pope Francis set a model for future synods. He simply said, I like what the bishop from Pakistan said. I was very moved by what he said about the martyrdom of his people. I was very touched by what the bishop from Asia said about how many people they now have joining the church in Korea. I was touched by, and so on. You get the picture. All he did was affirm what other people had said. It was really fascinating to see the model of that. Switch now to the current synod. And also at the end of the thing, we produced the final statement for the Assembly to vote on, which they did. And then the Pope issued his own apostolic exhortation, post-synodal apostolic exhortation. The Vatican does a great line in catchy titles. Post-synodal apostolic exhortation. And he published his own one called Dominus Vivit, which isn't nearly as good as our final statement, to be quite honest. Because Pope Francis can't resist being rhetorical, immediate, responsive. Our document was forensic about what the Church needs to do to engage young people and to promote vocations of all kinds. And it was a very much focused towards youth ministers and those who work with the young, school teachers and others. He said, that's all very good. He said, you do read it. And then he had a great thing about youth and how he loved youth, and it was all lovely. It's like a speech at World Youth Day, which is nice, but it's not very helpful in my view. I think the forensic thing is rather badly needed at the moment. So the new way of running a synod, we're all, by the way, in an aula, a hall, with tiers up like this. Cardinals at the front, bishops, religious, laymen, laywomen, like that. So halfway through, I said to Cardinal Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster, who's a friend of mine, I said, Vincent, why don't you ask the Pope if we could reverse this? Since this is a synod about the young, and all the young are at the back, and all the cardinals are at the front, and none of them are young. He said, I will. And I saw him the next day, he said, I asked him, I said, what did you say? He said, you must be mad. They'll never accept it. But fast forward to the current synod, and he's completely changed the way it works. So they're no longer in what was a room specially designed for the synod, in this tiered seating with a president at the front. He moved it into the Aula Paulo VI, the Paul VI hall, which is this huge audience hall, and they put round tables in, and the observers were no longer observers, they were members of the synod. So you had lay women, religious sisters, religious men, sitting at tables. So you would get, a lay woman from Indonesia sitting next to an American cardinal, and talking to each other. And what was emerging from those tables. A completely different way of doing it. Of course, some people pointed out, and it's kind of a fair point, it's a synod of bishops. And if you make laymen and women and others members of it, you can't really call it a synod of bishops anymore. So this is it's a kind of technical point, but it's quite an interesting one. You can call it whatever you like, but it's no longer a synod of bishops. And I think that is a bit tricky, because they're still calling it the synod of bishops. It's got people. So, but that's very Francis and very Latino. You just do it and you figure out the rules later. It does lead to some confusion, I have to say. So, but that's what he's done. And crucially, he passed a rule, because he's the Pope, he can do this. He passed a rule some years back, allowing that the Pope would no longer issue a post-synodal exhortation. He would simply say that the final document of the synod itself is now the teaching of the Church. And for the first time, he's done that with this synod just ended. He's not going to issue a post-synodal exhortation. He's just said, that's it, that final statement that's come from the assembly. So you can see what he's done is he's shifted the whole thing away from what was still a very hierarchical model, which had been the case since the Synod of Bishops was re-established after Vatican II. And of course, it was already a breakthrough. To have the Synod of Bishops revived, an ancient practice revived, but it was still on this very hierarchical model. And so he's completely changed that, which has taken many people by surprise, as much of what Pope Francis does takes us by surprise. And I don't know where it'll end up, but as you know, there was the first assembly, and then they went back to the world and said, how do you respond to this first draft statement? And then it came back. So it has been What one secular expert on management said was the world's largest ever consultation process. Now, if you count the numbers who participated in it, that's a great deal smaller than the numbers who were eligible for it. All Catholics, so 1 billion people were eligible for this consultation. 1 billion people. But a tiny number participated, and that's the other problem that is understandably made, is that only a small minority of people participate. The final thing, of course, that he's done is he's tried to avoid conflictive topics. So what he's done is he said that topics to do with women deacons would be given to another study group and taken out of the synod. Now, you could say that was a clever move, but of course it disappoints those who thought the synod was going to affirm the ordination of women as deacons. The synod avoided a head-on discussion of the LGBT question. Again, people disappointed. I think that on the whole, people thought that the synod would deal with these hot-button issues. And for those who expected that, the synod is a disappointment. However, if you view the synod as a culture shift rather than a policy shift, it has been and is a huge culture shift. And in my experience, before you have policy shift, you have to have culture shift. In other words, he's getting the church ready for what may come in the future. And already, even without the shifts of policy, he experiences chronic opposition from many people, to an extent that when I hear some of the people criticizing him and the process, I just say, look, I know you're very modern, but I'm an old-fashioned Catholic. I follow the Pope. That usually throws them a bit, since they're convinced they're the tradition. So, but I mean that sincerely. So when Pope Benedict XVI came to England, I was a spokesman for the church in England. The first state visit of the Pope in history, and I went out there to explain Pope Benedict in the media, sometimes with quite vigorous questioning, and sometimes a studio discussion with somebody opposing the Pope's visit. And I defended the Pope Benedict to the hilt. I didn't always agree with Pope Benedict, but as a spokesman for the church, it was my duty to explain him and to support him. And I just think that's how we all should be, while recognizing, as I said, that Pope Francis does sometimes, in my opinion, get it wrong. However, it's my job to support him and to try to understand the culture shift he's bringing about. But the policy shifts issue, it's a very, I think it's a very Latin American way he's dealing with it, where we don't lose face, we don't make anybody lose face, we don't challenge too much, we work around. However, there are people I respect who are saying, well, you can only keep this up for so long, and at a certain moment you have to face the difficult policy issues. But it's his judgment, and now is not the moment for that. And I have some sympathy with that, living as I do with the Church of England, which is, frankly, at the moment, and this is coming from Church of England people themselves, in a complete meltdown. You may have seen the Archbishop of Canterbury's resigned. They've got to find a successor. I think most of the bishops of the Church of England are in that situation where, you know, when we ask for volunteers, you turn your face away and hope that the chairman doesn't catch your eye. I mean, it's destroyed Justin Welby, it nearly destroyed Rowan Williams, who's a good friend of mine. It completely overwhelmed Rowan Williams, who is a fine and holy man. But because the Church of England is trying to deal with these hot button issues and keeps coming up with very Anglican solutions, namely, this is a solution designed to please everybody, and it pleases nobody. The gay marriage thing, classic. You know, we won't have gay marriage, but we will have the blessings of gay couples in church. And you're going, what? What is that? Because actually in the Catholic tradition,
the couple gets married and the priest simply blesses them. So if I'm now blessing a gay couple, in what sense am I not marrying them? And so you end up with this compromise. And both sides of the debate in the Anglican Church are very angry about it. And you think, well, that doesn't please anybody. So we have to be careful what we wish for. As I said, I love the Church of England. When I was a student at Oxford, I used to go to Evensong a lot because it's such a good liturgy. Lots of good Anglican friends still do. Love the Church of England, but I am watching it kind of collapse under the weight of these hot button issues. You know, so it's very tricky. So I've kind of meandered off there. I'll now bring myself back and say something about the origin of synods. There's a lot of good stuff about the historical origin of synods, but I want to say something about what I call the cultural origin of synods. When Cardinal Gregg, who's head of the Secretariat for the Synod, a very fine Maltese cardinal, very understated, nice, very nice man, very good at listening, when he launched the process, he quoted from the Rule of St. Benedict. The Rule of St. Benedict was written sometime after the year 500, so it's over 1,500 years old. It's the oldest rule of religious life in the Church. And it's still the rule that guides the Benedictine order. So, chapter 3 of the rule is called On Summoning the Brethren to Council. And Benedict says, whenever anything important is to be decided, let the abbot summon all the brethren. And he says, we must summon all the brethren because God often reveals what is best to the youngest. Often. As my novice master used to say, often, brother, but not always. But it is quite striking that in a very patriarchal society, he thinks the youngest are the ones who most often have the answer. And I think that's really telling. And so Cardinal Gregg quotes this. And it is, if you like, the cultural origin of it. And that in monasteries we have what's called a chapter, which is when all the brethren come together to decide things. But the other key thing is, and this is still the way the chapter works, Benedict goes on, after the abbot has heard all of the brethren, he then decides what is best. There is no vote. So it still remains the prerogative of the superior to make the decision after he's listened to everybody. And that is the piece about synodality that people miss. A synod is a listening assembly, but somebody must make a decision, and it's usually not by a vote. Now, canon law, as it's evolved, has instituted votes for all sorts of things. So in our chapter, if on certain issues there has to be a vote, which is binding. But in general, the abbot listens and then decides, or he can call for a vote. The abbot can say, I'd like to have a vote on this. Either a vote of show of hands or a vote by secret ballot. So the issue about who decides, and I think people have slightly missed that in the synod. As I said, the post-apostolic exhortation was the teaching of the Church, and the final document of the Assembly was the Assembly's advice to the Pope. And the Pope on this occasion said, I'm just going to bless the synod, the document of the Assembly. So, but we do still have a system, a process in the Catholic Church, which still depends on a hierarchical decision. No matter how much you literally reorganize the tables, which the Pope did, in the end, the Pope still decides. Now, you either think this is terrible or a great relief. Because if you go to a building called Church House in London, in Westminster, which is where the Assembly of the Anglican Synod meets, it's very telling. It's hired out for other conferences during the year, so I've been to several conferences there. And the Anglican Synod is organised in 3 houses: the House of Bishops, the House of Clergy, and the House of Laity. And around the Synod Hall in Church House in Westminster, this very fine, large hall, it has 6 doors. Clergy eyes, clergy nose, bishop's eyes, bishop's nose, laity eyes, laity nose. It's modelled on the Palace of Westminster just over the road. It's modelled on Parliament, whereas you may know the lobbies, and I think the Australian Parliament keeps some of this, the lobby, the eyes lobby and the nose lobby, and at the end of the vote, the tellers say either the eyes have it or the nose have it. I think Australian Parliament still do that. Yeah, it's all right, charming. And the same, and to get something through the Anglican Synod, it has to get a majority in all those houses. It's highly political, and in many ways quite disedifying. It's about as disedifying as the House of Commons. And you think, well, if this is the alternative, be careful what you wish for. And even with that highly democratic process, when it was announced that the Anglican Church's compromise was no gay marriage, but yes to blessing gay couples in church, a group of very significant, very low church evangelical churches in London, sitting in some of them, based in some of the most beautiful medieval churches in London, publicly announced, they made a video about it, with the 3 vicars of these churches saying, we are no longer in communion with the Bishop of London because the Anglican Church has ignored the clear teaching of Scripture about homosexual relations. We are no longer part of that, and we're creating our own community of churches. And you thought, wow, they went through a process you cannot believe it. They had a commission, they had reports, they had the votes in the synod, and still a group of people weren't happy. They just broke away. Left the Bishop of London with a major problem, because what she ought to do is she ought to excommunicate. But excommunicating people in the Church of England is not easy, because you end up in a court of law, because it's the church by law established. People can insist that it's heard in a court of law. So it gets very complicated. And so I just think, the model that Benedict had was listen especially to the youngest, and then the person in charge decides. That's the model that we have in synods of the Catholic Church. Does it please everybody? No, but it does maintain unity. And the Pope as the centre of unity seems to me the key function of the Pope, historically and currently. The successor of Peter is the touchstone of unity, and I think Francis knows that in his heart. That's his main task, is to keep people together. Or you have another system which is highly parliamentary, as the Anglican Church does, and you have votes and all of that, and you still end up with people unhappy. And it's very problematic in contemporary culture, because contemporary culture on the whole favours the parliamentary, but it can lead to this splintering even with that parliamentary law, because it raises expectations. And Pope Francis's danger was that he raised expectations about the synod, and do you know the story of the Grand Old Duke of York? He marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them down again. And my fear is that a lot of us felt we were being marched up to the top of the hill, and I said, yeah, I really worry we're going to get marched down again. And there is a bit of that about it. But coming back to the cultural point, it seems to me the biggest legacy of the synod is what has happened in church communities like yours. Creating a new local culture where people listen to each other and learn to be attentive to voices that disagree with you, and not to immediately go, well, I don't agree with you, but to go, thank you, I've heard that. And I think that's quite a breakthrough. If we can create a culture in which everybody's respectfully listened to, then there's a chance that we'll make better choices. Because, as my friend, the Jesuit general, Father Sosa, says, many people these days go in for what they call Ignatian discernment. But he said that usually means they don't want to make up their mind. And he said, all discernment results in a decision. If you have not made a decision, there has been no complete discernment. And I think it's that decision making that gets problematic. But we do have to make decisions. And after we've all listened carefully, we then have to say, if the decision doesn't go my way, I'm staying in the room. Because if the condition of my being in the room is you must agree with me, well, why were you in the room listening in the first place? So that's my take on where we are with synodality and its roots in the monastic tradition. Thank you.
I'd answer some questions before you give me the bottle of booze. Do you have some questions? Yes, Michael.
What's the message that we can take away from this in our future activities? Can you
I
give us
think
some
to
idea?
continue, as I said, I think the biggest change that the Synod is bringing about is at the local level. That you continue to work collectively at listening carefully to each other, especially the youngest, which I think is a bit of a challenge for this. But I think you have to acknowledge that. And say maybe our biggest task is to get some younger people into the room, which is a huge challenge, I know. But it's to recognise that there is a synodal way of running a parish. And I think because you don't have a parish priest running you, you're in a good position to do that. But at the same time, you have to be attentive to the tradition of the church. The difficulty with a community like this, it seems to me, is it can run away into the distance and lose touch with the rest of the church. So maybe there's a role as well of listening to the rest of the diocese, as well as to your own church, which is a bit self-selecting. So I think I would say that to learn to listen to the wider church, including the Archbishop of Sydney, of course, who you may not agree with. I don't always agree with Archbishop Fisher. I've had disagreements with him once or twice. But I do listen. We've got to listen. And if you're not listening to that, then you're not being really... If you're only listening to the people you agree with, you're not being really synodal. Thank you. Yes?
I think you're cutting the ground from under my question, Father. But why do we have, leaving the Bishop of Parramatta aside for one moment, such non-progressive leaders in the Australian Church when we've had Francis for 11 years now?
Yeah.
Surely he would have weeded out some of the problems the Bishop has done.
Okay. I'm getting the flavour of the local church.
I may not speak for everyone.
So, a couple of things about that. First of all, you can't weed out a bishop. You can if he's broken civil or canon law, as of course has been happening in Peru. You know? But you can't just say, I don't like the look of him. Okay? So Pope Benedict had a particular style of bishop he appointed. And Francis is different. It just takes time to change the character of the bishop's conference. Secondly, he has done some quite interesting things about the appointment of cardinals in the Australian Church, as you may have noticed.
You're using the word church broadly.
Broadly, yeah. So, it's in my view, you are blessed with some actually very good archbishops. I think Mark Kolovich is a very deeply impressive man. I met him, very impressive. And he was president of the Bishops' Conference, wasn't he? Yeah. I think on the whole, your bishops do elect a sensible president of the conference. So, be careful what you wish for, and learn to appreciate what the bishops you don't agree with are bringing to the peace. And I want to connect that to the young. The reality is that the baby boomers, that's you and me, right? The gulf between our culture and the culture of the 20-year-olds is just huge. You probably know that with your grandchildren. And the reality is that those in their 20s who do go to church, and for whom church is a key part of their lives, on the whole, like the more conservative bishops.
That's the reality, and you see it in seminaries. Now, this is not straightforward, but if we believe that the synodal church is about listening, and especially listening to the youngest, we have to take that on board. We simply can't say, they're wrong and I'm right. Because at that point, what you've done is you've become the new hierarchical dominant group who are telling other people what to think. It's, you know, yesterday's rebels can become tomorrow's dictators. You know, we see that in politics the whole time. So there is a real challenge there as to listening. And our congregation is, you know, a very traditional congregation. We like dressing up. We wear habits. We love good vestments. We sing Gregorian chant. All of that. We know that's really popular with the young. And so, you know, we're a bit lucky. We still have some of that in our lockers, so to speak. Take the one that is the complete mystery, I think, to an older generation, is adoration. The young love Eucharistic adoration. So, you have to take them on board. If you started running Eucharistic adoration vigils for the young, you'd get lots of young people coming. You might not like Eucharistic adoration. Well, bad luck. It's what the young want, and it's part of the tradition. You can't say it isn't. And it's having a great revival. So that Eucharistic adoration to me is a really interesting pinch point here. So the old generation said, Mass is for celebrating, not for putting in a monstrance. And the other generation doesn't know that discussion. It knows Mass is for celebrating, and it wants the Eucharistic adoration. Sorry. Yes, another question.
Since you had referred to the Anglican Church,
Yes.
I'd like to reflect on your good relationship.
Yep.
You probably know how Pope Benedict XVI had made it possible for an Anglican priest to be ordained into the Catholic priesthood in spite of that his marriage.
Yes.
And the wife also partakes in the ordination.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, how is this progressing?
So to me, the big surprise is that Benedict has not allowed the ordination of married men to the priesthood. It's
But
a
it
big-
happened here in Warunda.
Well, it's happened when you've been a former Anglican or a Lutheran, whatever. But he doesn't. You can't ordain married men who've been brought up in the Catholic faith, unless I'm missing something. But on the whole, I mean, that's the missing piece. I don't understand why he hasn't done it. Well, I do a bit, but it could be done without anybody being able to challenge it as undermining the tradition. Some people say it would undermine the sacral nature of the priesthood. I don't get that. And I'm speaking as someone who is a monk, which means people in my order can never be married and ordained. And it would highlight more clearly the distinction between belonging to a religious order and being a Dawson priest. It would highlight the difference. So, I don't understand why Pope Francis hasn't done that.
So there is no progress accordingly?
Well, of course, you know, trying to follow the mind of Pope Francis, not straightforward. A former student of mine and now a good friend, Christopher Lamb, is the Vatican CNN correspondent. And he thinks that Francis has an agenda of things he wants to achieve, and he doesn't think that's top of his list. And he knows every time he makes a reform, he'll get a kickback. So he chooses the battles he wants to win and leaves somebody else to do the others. I think that's the Yes, hello.
Thank you, Father, for that. When you speak about the youth, are you
Yes.
speaking about the youth in the United Kingdom, or are you speaking about the youth here? And if you're speaking about the youth here, could you tell us where these young people are in church?
With addresses, please.
With addresses, names and addresses supplied. I'm talking about my global experience. So, for example, we have 3 monasteries in the United States, which I'm responsible for, as well as ones in the UK, Ireland, Sweden, here in Australia, Peru, Zimbabwe, so quite a wide spectrum. And in most of those places, people are turning to I just take that example of Eucharistic adoration in much greater numbers among young people. Now, I don't know enough about the Australian church, but on the whole, I think the Australian church mirrors the church in Europe and America. And so there will be young people here who are part of various movements. There are various global movements for young people where you find them. Now, it might be that I'm wrong, that Australia has none of this, but I'd be interested to know whether others have had experience of something like Youth 2000, which is very popular in America and the UK. Other youth groups attached to religious congregations. The community of St. John in Europe, very strong, has a youth group attached. So there are, and well, what I'd say is if there aren't, now you've got your mission. You start it. It strikes me there's a lot of expertise in the room, and maybe a little bit of money. And with that, you could say, well, why don't we start it?
Can I just
I
say
think it's a bit of a
something?
big challenge, because you need to get a group of young people. You can't do it without the young. You know, nothing about me without me. You'd have to get a group of young people who say, we want to start this here. Yes?
But on that, I can't believe you just said that, because last night my son, who's 35, said to me, looking at his Instagram, of course, he said, oh my God, schoolies aren't like what they used to be. And I thought, oh, what do you mean? He said, they're getting baptised in the river. But I didn't go on to ask him where, and he said, this is happening here at the schoolies up in Queensland. Now, I didn't follow it up. I got such a shock. I thought, well, maybe that's the beginning.
The research shows, certainly, I can only draw on both anecdotal and research evidence from the UK, but I'm involved at the moment in a really, I think, significant project on the future of confession, the sacrament of reconciliation. And the research evidence makes it clear that young Catholics are going to confession more frequently than older Catholics. It's really significant. Again, it's something to do with a new generation reclaiming elements of the tradition that they feel the older generation have neglected. And the parallel I use is, when John Lennon started wearing his grandfather's World War I trench coat, what was that about? He made it the height of fashion, but at first it looked like, well, that's very backward looking. But he took the old thing and made it the future. So I think there's a bit of that. The youth are going into the cupboard and finding these practices, which the key thing is, these practices clearly meet their needs in a way that they don't meet the needs of an older generation. The young want what Father talked about in his sermon, prayerful awe. Prayerful awe is what adoration and benediction is about. Adoration of the sacrament is about prayerful awe. Secondly, they desperately want healing from the wounds of modern society. They are very, very wounded by the culture around them in a way that you probably have learned to protect yourselves from elements of it. They haven't. They're all deeply wounded, especially by the sexual culture. And so they find confession is amazing, a place where I go to be healed and be given. Oh, that's just what I want. And I want to do it privately. I don't want to do it with any of you lot. I want to do it privately because I'm a bit ashamed and find it all very difficult. And if I can find a place where I can go and hear the words of forgiveness, that's just what I need. Can you see how this might work? Yeah, yes.
I taught scripture in a high school for 21 years, and some very brave priests would, on rare occasions, come into classrooms with me, and occasionally would offer reconciliation to the students. And the students would agree, walk out into the courtyard and have their confession first. So they had to stand up in front of their classmates and
Go.
go. And they evangelize each other more than we can.
Yeah.
And the students would remark, "Oh, Miss, look, her face is glowing," when she re-entered the room.
I think because most people were thinking like you. We know the Catholic Church doesn't listen. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And those who did take part in some of the groups I was involved in were saying things like, when I came out of that meeting, I felt that the church had heard my voice for the first time when I'm aged 50. I felt, and another one, for the first time I felt the church was treating me as an adult, not as a child. So that's really about the effect in the local communities. And can I just circle back to about the youth, because it's not disconnected. There is something called the National Catholic Youth Festival, which is held in Australia every year. The next one is in Melbourne in 2025. You can go on the website. You'll see pictures of crowds of enthusiastic young Catholic youth. So they are there. Similarly, I was the director of England and Wales participation in World Youth Day for several years. And so I had to help with a team organise that. And I used to meet with the other English-speaking directors from around the world. And it was clear to all of us that the Australian church had the best youth ministry of any of us. You had some very fine youth ministers. So, you know, find out where they are. I suspect that the Archdiocese of Sydney has a very strong youth ministry. I'd be very surprised. Anthony Fisher is very good with young people. I've seen it with my own eyes. As I said, I had a disagreement with him, but I recognise he's pastoral very effective. And he wants 50 million quid for renew the cathedral, $50 million. So good luck to him. Oh, yes.
The issue of submissions to the synod.
Yeah.
I did it, and there were quite a few who I knew who did it, and yet there were other parishes within the diocese and other parishes or dioceses when we've travelled around who knew nothing about it.
Well, some parish clergy refused them anything to do with it,
Nothing.
which was very, very that was very, very unacceptable, not to mention, because it was the bishops asking for them.
Now, one of the major things, because we all know probably most of our friends are disaffected Catholics, or many of them are disaffected Catholics, and one of the primary reasons, or the last nail, if you like, in the coffin, was child sex abuse.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, that was addressed here, as you know.
It's addressed here very, very effectively.
But a lot of people, a huge number, have been affected in terms of their adherence to coming to church and being participating because of that.
Yep.
All it really takes, and the multiple recommendations that were made in individual submissions were that there needs to be a major demonstrable apology and some sort of demonstrable activity that's like we have here, walking across the bridge for Sorry Day and things like that. There just needs to be some major thing where the church humbles itself in relation to that issue, and I believe that would be transformative in terms of a lot of people's interest in maybe coming back.
This is another whole book to open. Because it's another whole book to open. I was elected into this role primarily to be the face of our congregation in the British equivalent of the Royal Commission. And I had to sit through 6 weeks of a public hearing about abuse by the monks of my congregation. So I have a lot to say about it, but I dare not start, because I think it's a separate topic. Is that all right? I'm not running away from it. The very opposite. It's just there is so much to say about it. Just a final question though. Do you have something here called Loud Fence? Loud Fence is an organisation that gets the agreement of local churches and especially cathedrals to hold a ceremony doing what you're suggesting, and then survivors tie multicoloured ribbons to the fence of the church to indicate that. You do have that. It's very effective. In a very understated way, it makes a loud statement.
Just carrying on to Bill's point, the leadership is not in the bishops. The leadership is here.
Yeah.
We do not have courageous leaders who are bishops, leaving aside the Bishop of Parramatta at one moment. We simply don't have that sort of courage in our leaders.
I think we need to actually, we could go on.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. I
There's
think
our leader.
Yes, yes. So,
that is another whole ball.
absolutely, come back again.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could tell people about the book, just briefly.
Oh, yes, quick promo opportunity. My latest book is called Finding the Language of Grace, about how language can either be a source of grace or disgrace, which is quite topical in the current politics. So it's published by Bloomsbury, available here in Australia.
Well, Don, Christopher, thank you. First of all, you've drawn the curtain back on the Synod in Rome, on both of them, and given us better understanding, as well as some background on your own congregation, the Benedictines. But amazingly, I think you've managed to capture all of the complexities and inconsistencies and needs and desires of our community. We're not disaffected Catholics, but in a way, we cling together because of our mixture of concern and expectation about the future of the church. And now, at least, even if we don't agree on policy, we certainly agree on culture.
Yeah.
Maybe we're all older. We know we're not going to change the world, but we can look after each other.
Yeah.
And you captured a whole lot of that. The key thing that we do, I think, out of all the things we do, is we choose our own priests. And Neil, you might think Neil's a good joke teller, but he's far deeper than that. PhD. So, on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you. It's been